communism. You like the weekend? Thank a union for that. Thank some communists for that, okay?
Zionism is not colonialism. This is an incredibly easy one to refute, as I've already mentioned. The founders, pioneers, and important figures of Zionism openly referred to their aspirations as colonial. They even shamelessly used the word. Theodore Herzl, remember him from earlier, penned a letter to infamous colonizer Cecil Rhodes in 1902, where he asked for Cecil's help and openly referred to Zionism as something colonial. In the letter, Herzl can be seen asking Rhodes to put his stamp of authority on the Zionist plan. Keep in mind, Cecil Rhodes is like the LeBron James of doing colonization. But this wasn't the only time Herzl made clear his colonialist ambitions. In his famous pamphlet, The Jewish State, he wrote, "We should there, in Palestine, form a portion of a rampart of Europe against Asia, an outpost of civilization as opposed to barbarism. We should, as a neutral state, remain..."
Damn, bro. This seems crazy. What? Ain't no way, dude. Ain't no way. What? Yeah, what the hell, LeBron James is right. What the heliante? What?
In contact with all of Europe, which would have to guarantee our existence. Aside from Herzl, important Zionist figures like Ze'ev Jabotinsky, the founder of the revisionist Zionist movement, referred to Zionism as colonial an ungodly amount of times. Here's an excerpt from his essay, The Iron Wall, where he says, "We cannot offer any compensation for Palestine. Therefore, a voluntary agreement is unthinkable. Our colonization must either stop or continue against the will of the native population." As Rashid Khalidi put it, the social and economic institutions founded by the early Zionists, which were central to the success of the Zionist project, were also unquestioningly understood by all and described as colonial. The most important of these institutions was the Jewish Colonization Association. So the claim that Zionism is not colonialism is such pure cope, given the fact that the pioneers of the movement, as well as many of its prominent figures, openly admitted that it was. Here's another example. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the Yishuv, the Zionist Settler Society in Palestine.
It's funny because I brought, for people who were criticizing my Matt Duss conversation, like I brought all of this up to him when he tried to say that Zionism was not exterminationist in principle, and that the early Zionists who considered themselves to be Zionists, who wanted like a place for Jews to exist comfortably and peacefully, including Albert Einstein, would be now reflected on as anti-Zionists for the sentiments that they expressed before the inception of the nation state of Israel, like Albert fucking Einstein. Also, this is why I said the president of Moravia looked exactly like David Ben-Gurion, because he does. Look at this. In Superman, the president of Moravia was obviously like a holdover for Benjamin Netanyahu. That's fair. That's a fair assessment. Except he looked exactly like David Ben-Gurion.
Prior to Israel's founding, and later the country's first prime minister, viewed indigenous Palestinians and Arabs more broadly as inherently inferior. He made it clear that the Zionist movement was a European colonial project primarily concerned with the well-being of European Ashkenazi Jews. As historian Avi Shleim noted, Ben-Gurion declared that the Jews in Muslim countries had lived in a society that was backward, corrupt, uneducated, and lacking in independence and self-respect. He argued that only the younger ones could be saved, claiming the older generation was too far gone and risked turning Israel into a Levantine state. It's also worth mentioning the form of colonialism that Zionism is. Not all types of colonial...
Isn't that dude, it's literally like, it's the same shit of like Americans, naming their fucking missile systems Tomahawk. You know what I mean? First, they fucking say these are barbaric savages. Then they ethnically cleanse the indigenous population, claim that they're barbaric savages. Then they turn around and they go, oh, Apache helicopters, Tomahawk missiles. It's the same shit. David Ben-Gurion, in the process of ethnic cleansing, says we must not become a Levantine culture. Once the ethnic cleansing campaign is unfolded, or at least the Israeli nation state is incepted, 75 years, 80 years later, what do Israelis say? Oh, what do you mean? We are a part of the Middle East. We are Levantine. Why? Why you hate Israel? Israel, very important part of Levantine culture. Meanwhile, in the initiation And still to this day, a big part of the ethnic cleansing operations was the cultural erasure of Palestinians, the cultural erasure of any sort of like Levantine, any sort of Middle Eastern, any sort of Arab culture forcibly. A part of the insidious nature of eco-fascism that Israel implements is literally the pay $1 to fucking plant a tree in Israel project they have, right? The fucking trees that they have planted, they've planted on top of the olive trees that they've burned down. Olive trees that take hundreds of years to fucking develop. Okay? They burn it down and they bring in invasive species because they want to make Israel at the time look more European.
Colonialism take the same shape, and some are arguably even more insidious. Zionism is settler colonial, which differs from classical colonialism. In classical colonialism, the goal is to control and exploit without replacing the local population. In settler colonialism, the goal is to replace the native population. Settlers come to stay and build a new society. They're often unwanted at home, and they're used by empires to expand influence by creating loyal outposts abroad. So as horrific as all other forms of colonialism are, settler colonialism is uniquely genocidal, as it is predicated on what historian Patrick Wolfe deems the logic of elimination. God gave the land of Palestine to the Jewish people exclusively. For this segment, I set my sights on the Hebrew Bible so we can get right to the source of God's word. A fundamental principle articulated in the Torah is that the land ultimately belongs to God, not any single people in perpetuity. Leviticus 25:23 represents God's wishes and states clearly, "The land shall not be sold in perpetuity, for the land is mine. You are strangers and sojourners with me." This verse reframes the connection of the Israelites to the land as one of stewardship rather than outright ownership. The Israelites' relationship to the land is portrayed as conditional in the Bible, based on covenantal obedience, not absolute ownership. And given that the Israelis today break almost all of God's rules, from killing to theft to occupation, I'd say they aren't being all too obedient at the moment. There is no divine, unconditional right to the land given by God in the Bible. Deuteronomy 28 lists blessings for obedience and curses for disobedience, stating that those who disobey God's covenant are to be exiled from the land. As Leviticus 18:28 reaffirms, the Israelites are to be vomited out if they break the covenant or defile the land. I would say that constantly bombing the daylights out of your holy land probably counts as defiling it, and doing a genocide most likely is not in compliance with the covenant.
Yeah, I don't even entertain the theological arguments anyway. I think it's fucking nonsensical. But, you know, there is definitely also a theological counter argument to everything that Israel is doing, because everything that Israel is doing is bad. And religion is supposed to be a social text, like a rule book of, you know, what best practices to follow. And therefore, it's going to say things like, don't murder people, don't steal from people. You know, that's kind of the whole game, right? Therefore, you're automatically disqualifying if you are engaging in some kind of nation-state project that requires the extermination of people that were living there before you implemented this settler colonial operation.
Given that bloodshed and murder are constantly portrayed as defiling or polluting the land, as is shown in Numbers 35, 33 through 34. Clearly, the land is depicted as morally reactive and willing to expel the unjust. Aside from all this, the biblical text also contains provisions for the inclusion of non-Israelites. In Ezekiel 47, 22 through 23, God's vision of a restored Israel commands that the land be divided as an inheritance for both the Israelites and the strangers who sojourn among you, and that these strangers shall be to you as native born among the children of Israel. They shall have an inheritance with you among the tribes of Israel. This passage directly contradicts the idea of an ethnically exclusive right to the land. Another point worth mentioning here is that Zionists rely heavily on this biblical superstitious talking point, but ignore the fact that many of the pioneers of political Zionism were secular or atheists. David Ben-Gurion, the leader of the pre-state settler society in Palestine and later the first...
a national socialist, if you will. That's what he was. And much like historic national socialists, he focused primarily on the nationalism aspect and not so much on the socialism aspect. Does that remind you of a guy? Certainly reminds me of a guy. You know?
Prime Minister of Israel openly referred to himself as an atheist, which reminds me of this pertinent quote from Ilan Pappé. The secular Jews who founded the Zionist movement wanted paradoxically both to secularize Jewish life and to use the Bible as a justification for colonizing Palestine. In other words, they did not believe in God, but he, nonetheless, promised them Palestine.